I still remember the first time I stepped into that village. The air smelled different. Not the fried food city kind of smell we're used to today, but a mix of rice fields, smoke from wood fires, and the faint tang of horse sweat. Yeah. Not exactly the scent of a luxury spa, but back then this was the smell of life. The year, somewhere in the Edo period, between the 1600s and 1800s, Japan was sealed off from most of the world, living its own drama. And me? I somehow found myself in a tiny samurai village, tucked between green hills and the slow curve of a river. I didn't know it then, but this place was a whole world with rules stricter than your grandma's house. First impressions. The first thing that hit me were the houses. Wooden walls, sliding doors made of paper, and roofs that looked like they were constantly one typhoon away from disaster. The villagers moved in and out, carrying buckets of water, bundles of rice stalks, or just themselves, heads bowed, shoulders hunched. Nobody was wasting time. And then there was the daimyo's manor, the fortified house of the local lord. Compared to the humble huts, this thing looked like a medieval fortress. High wooden walls, watchtowers, guards at the gates. Basically, if the peasants' homes were little sandcastles, the daimyo's place was the whole beach. The social ladder of doom. Here's the thing about this society. Everything was a hierarchy, and not the everyone's equal kind of thing your school teachers preach. Oh no. This was samurai on top, swords, armor, pride, farmers under them, backbone of the economy, breaking their backs in rice fields, artisans below that, making pots, swords, and sandals, merchants at the bottom, yeah, even though they handled money. Talk about irony. The more you had, the less respect you got. And somewhere floating in the gray zone were people like me, an observer, sometimes mistaken for a servant, sometimes just ignored. Honestly, being ignored was my favorite, my spot in the village. So, where did I fit? Think of me like the awkward guest who overstays their welcome at a family dinner. I wasn't samurai, I wasn't a farmer. I was just there. People didn't trust me enough to let me join the rice planting, but they didn't shoo me away either. I carried buckets when told, swept floors when needed, and listened. That was my role. Listener. And in a place where everyone's life was basically a performance on the stage of feudal Japan, being the audience wasn't too bad. The rhythm of the day morning started early. And by early, I mean roosters haven't even finished their dreams yet, kind of early. A drum would sound from the village center, and suddenly the whole place came alive. Farmers grabbed their tools and marched into the fields. Women rushed to cook rice, weave cloth, or herd the children before they ran off to do mischief. The samurai? They walked around like roaming Wi-Fi signals, always present, always making sure you knew they were around. Their hands rested casually on the hilts of their katanas, like someone flexing at the gym. Yeah, I've got a sword. What about it? Evenings were quieter. Lanterns flickered on. Smoke curled into the night sky. And kids finally stopped pretending they were tiny samurai warriors fighting invisible bandits. Meals were humble, mostly rice, sometimes fish, and if the gods were generous, a bit of miso soup. The culture shock 101. What shocked me most wasn't the poverty, though trust me, life here wasn't a picnic. It was the discipline. Everyone knew their place, their role, their duties. It wasn't just about following rules. It was about surviving. Break the system and the whole thing collapsed. So people obeyed. Farmers bent their backs, artisans hammered their tools, merchants bowed lower than carpets, and samurai, well, they made sure nobody forgot who kept order. And yet, in between all that discipline, There were moments of softness, a farmer pausing to watch his kids chase fireflies, an old woman sitting on her porch, weaving while humming a tune older than the village itself. Even the samurai, for all their stone-faced pride, sometimes cracked a smile when watching children play. My first real, oh wow, moment. I'll never forget walking past the rice fields one afternoon. The sun was hitting the water just right, turning the paddies into giant mirrors. Dozens of farmers moved in unison, bent low, planting each seedling with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. It was backbreaking, muddy, sweaty work, and yet it looked like a dance. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just daily life, this was their world. No phones, no cars, no internet to complain about the weather, just the land, the seasons, and the endless rhythm of duty. I won't lie. Part of me wanted to run back to modern life and binge watch something stupid. But another part was hooked. Humor in the harshness. Of course, not every moment was noble or poetic. Chickens chased me more times than I care to admit. Kids laughed at me for not knowing how to tie a proper straw sandal. And once I tripped over a bucket in front of a samurai guard. Let's just say, the look he gave me was scarier than any death glare from a school teacher. But even those moments made the place feel alive. This wasn't some fantasy land of honor and swords. It was messy, muddy, full of awkward silences, and honestly, kind of funny at times. Wrapping up the first glimpse. So there I was, standing in a samurai village, watching life unfold like clockwork. The rigid social order pressed down on everyone, but there was also beauty hidden in the cracks. The soft glow of lanterns at night, the echo of wooden sandals on dirt paths, the laughter of kids who didn't care about class or duty yet. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was real. And as I settled in, I realized if I was going to survive here, or at least not embarrass myself daily, I had to understand the samurai, their ways, and how this whole system held together. But that's a story for the next chapter. If you've ever watched a samurai movie and thought, wow, these guys must have spent their whole lives slicing enemies in slow motion, well, reality check. Most samurai in the Edo period weren't fighting daily duels. They were more like the all-in-one package deal. Warriors, administrators, tax collectors, and part-time babysitters of the social order. Basically, imagine your city's mayor, accountant, cop, and school principal, all rolled into one, but carrying a sword that could slice your excuses in half. Who were the samurai, really? So who exactly were these men, and sometimes women, though far fewer? Samurai were the ruling military class of Japan. Think of them as the upper crust, not because they had yachts or sports cars, but because they had land, privileges, and most importantly, the right to carry swords. Two of them, actually, the katana, the long blade, the one everyone drools over, and the wakizashi, the shorter companion blade. This set was called the daisho, which basically meant the big and little. Carrying them wasn't just for protection. It was like walking around with your resume glued to your hip. It said, "I'm samurai, respect the vibe." But here's the twist. Since the Edo period was relatively peaceful, thanks Tokugawa shogunate, most samurai didn't actually fight wars. Instead, they spent their days running villages, collecting taxes, solving disputes, and making sure no one stepped out of line. Imagine studying martial arts your whole life, only to end up doing paperwork and scolding rice farmers. Their look, fashion, but deadly. If you saw one walking down the dirt road, you knew instantly. The Sean Mage hairstyle, the shaved top with a little top knot, wasn't just a fashion statement, it was mandatory. Think of it as the samurai uniform, like a badge of honor. though honestly, it looked like someone halfway through a bad haircut. Their clothing, a kimono underneath, topped with a wide-legged trouser skirt thing called hakama. And for formal events, a jacket with the family crest, known as a haori. Add the swords and boom, instant intimidation. Armor was mostly reserved for emergencies, but when they put it on, they looked like walking iron statues. And let's not forget the swagger. Even if a samurai was just walking to the outhouse, the way he held himself screamed, "I could cut you down, but I'm too polite to bother right now." Training, no pain, no honor. The samurai didn't just own swords, they lived them. From a young age, training was brutal. Kenjutsu, swordsmanship, kyudo, archery, horse riding, even spear fighting. It was all part of the package. And no, they didn't get to skip practice because it was raining. A samurai kid's childhood made modern boot camps look like summer camp. And it wasn't only about weapons. A true samurai trained the mind too. Calligraphy, poetry, and meditation were part of the deal. Why? Because controlling your pen strokes or your breath was as important as swinging a sword. The body was the blade, but the mind was the sheath. Without discipline, you'd just be a hot-headed guy waving steel around, and nobody respected that. The code, Bushido-a, the famous Bushido, the way of the warrior. It wasn't written down in one official book, but more like a set of values everyone lived and sometimes died by. Honor, loyalty, duty, courage, and self-control. Basically, the samurai version of the Boy Scouts oath, except if you broke it, you might have to commit ritual suicide. Yeah, no pressure. Loyalty was everything. Your daimyo, lord, was your world, and you'd serve him even if it cost your life. Honor meant keeping your word, not acting like a fool, and facing danger without flinching. Discipline? That was the glue holding it all together. Bushido wasn't about being macho all the time, though. It also meant knowing when to show mercy, when to write a poem, or when to enjoy a tea ceremony. Balance mattered. Imagine Batman with a taste for haiku. That's Bushido in a nutshell. Relationship with the peasants. Now here's where things get tricky. Samurai and peasants lived side by side, but the relationship was complicated. On one hand, peasants respected samurai as protectors of the land. On the other, they feared them, because one wrong move could mean punishment, sometimes fatal. It was like living next door to the strictest teacher you've ever had, the one who might give you candy one day and detention the next. A farmer might bow low in respect, but inside he's probably thinking, "Please don't take more rice this year, we're already starving." But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some samurai genuinely cared for their people, helping in famines, joining festivals, or even teaching village kids discipline. Others, total jerks with swords. Depends on the person, just like today. My first samurai encounter, speaking of jerks, or maybe heroes, let me tell you about the first samurai I personally ran into. Picture this. I was awkwardly trying to carry 2 buckets of water with a yoke across my shoulders. Naturally, I tripped. Buckets flew, water splashed everywhere, and I basically looked like a drowned rat. Cue. Samurai enters. He was tall, stern, his kimono crisp, his swords gleaming. I froze. My brain screamed, "Well, this is it. I'm going to get cut down for disrespecting the road with puddles." But instead of slicing me, he just raised one eyebrow and said something along the lines of, "Clumsy work harder next time." Then he walked off like a character exiting stage left. My knees almost gave out in relief. Still, that little encounter taught me everything I needed to know. Samurai weren't out hunting for excuses to kill, but they expected order, effort, and respect at all times. Mess up too often, though, Yeah, good luck. Wrapping it up, so who were the samurai in village life? Not just sword-swinging warriors, but the backbone of the social system. They were judges, leaders, tax collectors, and the embodiment of discipline. They looked intimidating, trained like maniacs, and lived by a code that demanded more than just skill. It demanded a whole way of life. And me? I was just trying not to trip over another bucket in front of them. But as I spent more time in the village, I realized something. While the samurai were fascinating, the real heart of the place wasn't just them. It was the common folk, the farmers, the artisans, the women weaving late into the night, the people whose sweat and sacrifice kept everything turning. And that's where we'll go next. If the samurai were the face of the village, the peasants were the beating heart. They didn't wear swords, they didn't sit in fancy manners, and they definitely didn't write poems about cherry blossoms while sipping tea. Nope. They were out there, mud on their legs, sunburn on their backs, sweat dripping into their eyes, just trying to survive one season at a time. Honestly, if you want to understand Edo period Japan, forget the swords for a second. Look at the rice fields. That's where the real story was written. Rice is life. Everywhere you looked, there were rice paddies, flat squares of watery earth that stretched like mirrors reflecting the sky. Rice wasn't just food here. It was currency, wealth, and survival rolled into one. Even taxes were paid in rice, not coins. A lord's power wasn't measured in gold, but in koku, the amount of rice it took to feed one person for a year. So farmers weren't just workers, they were the foundation holding the entire social pyramid upright. No rice, no samurai. No rice, no daimyo. No rice, no Japan as they knew it. Which meant farmers had the most important job, but also the heaviest burden. Back-breaking work. A farmer's day began before dawn. The village drum or bell would sound, and the whole household stirred. Men headed out to the paddies with tools slung over their shoulders. The fields weren't some postcard perfect landscape. They were muddy, swampy, filled with bugs that saw human ankles as an all-you-can-eat buffet. Men bent low, planting seedlings one by one, while the summer sun fried their backs. During harvest season, the pressure doubled. If you messed up, you weren't just ruining your own dinner. You were threatening the daimyo's tax collection. And trust me, nobody wanted that smoke. Women's work was just as intense. While men toiled outside, women ran the homes like command centers. They cooked, spun thread, wove cloth, cared for kids, managed food supplies, and helped in the fields during planting and harvest. If men were the backbone, women were the tendons holding everything together. Taxes, the eternal villain. Now let's talk about taxes. Oh boy, imagine you work a whole year, and when it's time to enjoy your hard-earned rice, someone knocks on your door and says, "Thanks, I'll take 60% of that." That was life. Peasants paid a massive portion of their harvest to the daimyo. The samurai collected it, wrote down the numbers, and carried it off to the lord's storehouses. What was left? Enough to keep the farmers alive? Barely. Some years, when weather was cruel, families literally starved after paying their dues. So yeah, peasants respected the daimyo. But I'm guessing a lot of silent curses floated through the fields during tax season. Market days and artisans. It wasn't all misery, though. On certain days, villages buzzed with markets. Artisans rolled in with their goods. Pottery, sandals, wooden toys, farming tools, even the occasional flashy kimono for those who could afford it. Blacksmiths hammered out blades and hoes. Carpenters repaired plows. And traveling merchants sold salt, oil, and luxuries from bigger towns. Market day was the closest thing peasants got to a holiday. It was business, yes, but also social. People gossiped, kids played, and the air smelled of grilled fish and smoke. If you ever want to see a village truly alive, don't look at the rice paddies. Look at the market square, when everyone's voices are blending into one big hum. Festivals and faith hardship didn't stop people from celebrating. In fact, festivals were survival tools in their own right, tiny bursts of joy in lives filled with labor. There were Shinto festivals for planting and harvest, Buddhist ceremonies to honor ancestors, and New Year celebrations where the entire village lit lanterns and prayed for good fortune. People danced, sang, beat drums, and for a night or two forgot about taxes and mud. The temple stood as the spiritual anchor. Monks guided villagers through rituals, blessed fields, and offered comfort in times of famine or loss. Even the toughest farmer bowed low in front of the temple bell, because in a world where crops failed and sickness struck without warning, faith was as important as food. Gender roles up close. Life divided clearly between men and women, but both carried insane loads of responsibility. Men, fieldwork, taxes, maintaining irrigation, carrying goods. Women, household management, spinning, weaving, raising children, helping in harvest, and children. No childhood as we'd imagine today. Boys started helping in fields early, and girls learned to weave or cook before they could properly pronounce rice. Childhood was basically an apprenticeship for adult life. Still, there were sweet moments, kids chasing fireflies or families gathered by lantern light in the evenings. It wasn't Disney-level magical, but it was something. Hardships, the ugly side. Let's not romanticize too much. Life was brutal. Famines hit hard. If the harvest failed, people starved. Diseases spread easily in close quarters. And with medicine limited to herbal remedies and prayers, survival was often just luck. Natural disasters, typhoons, floods, earthquakes, Japan had plenty. Imagine watching a year's worth of labor get washed away in one night. It happened more often than anyone liked to admit. And through all that, the taxes didn't stop. The daimyo's rice had to flow, even if the villagers were gnawing on tree bark. A day in the life. Let me paint you one full day. At sunrise, drums echo across the village. Farmers eat a quick bowl of rice porridge, thin, watery, but filling enough to get moving. By the time the mist lifts, men are already knee-deep in paddies, planting or weeding in rows. Back in the home, smoke curls from cooking fires. Women stir pots, feed children, then sit at looms or spin thread while keeping an eye on the youngest. A baby cries, a pot overboils, someone yells about firewood. It's chaos, but organized chaos. Midday, people grab a quick meal, maybe rice balls with pickled vegetables. Work never truly stops. Even the breaks are short. Evening falls. Lanterns glow along narrow streets. Kids run wild until mothers drag them inside. Families gather, eating rice, with maybe a sliver of fish if they're lucky. Stories are told, songs hummed, and by nightfall everyone collapses into sleep, only to rise and do it all over again. Monotony, absolutely, but it was life. And within that rhythm, there was dignity. My place among them. Living alongside these villagers, I felt both admiration and guilt. Admiration for their strength, patience, and ability to laugh, even when life gave them scraps. Guilt, because I knew I didn't share their burdens. I could step out of the story one day. They couldn't. Still, they welcome me in small ways. A farmer's wife once handed me a rice ball, laughing at how clumsy I looked trying to balance buckets. A group of kids taught me a silly game involving pebbles, tiny gestures, but they stitched me into their world, if only on the edges. Wrapping up. So while the samurai strutted around with swords and codes of honor, it was the peasants who carried the real weight. Rice on their backs, taxes on their heads, prayers on their lips. They weren't heroes in shiny armor. They were tired, muddy, sunburned, and often hungry. But without them, nothing else in that society could exist. And as I sat under the lantern glow, listening to laughter echo across the dirt paths, I realized this was the soul of the samurai village. Not the lord in his manor, not the warrior polishing his katana, but the farmer, the weaver, the child chasing fireflies. Next, though, I had to face another side of life here, the darker side. The rules, the punishments, the constant reminder that order was enforced not just with rice, but with steel. That's where we're heading. Conflict, order, and justice. Living in a samurai village wasn't just about rice paddies and lantern-lit nights. Underneath the rhythm of farming and festivals lurked something sharper, the constant reminder that rules weren't suggestions. They were carved into daily life like grooves in a sword. Break them, and you'd quickly learn how strict justice could be in feudal Japan. The silent watch of authority. You didn't always see conflict, but you always felt the authority. It was like humidity, always there, even when invisible. Samurai didn't hover over villagers every second, but everyone knew, step out of line, and sooner or later, a judgment would come. There was no such thing as just ignore the rules here. The Edo period was obsessed with order. The shogun kept peace across the land, and daimyo enforced it in their territories. Samurai acted as the eyes and hands of this system, making sure peasants paid taxes, kept the peace, and didn't start any funny business like rebellions. Honestly, it was less land of freedom and more land of strict parents watching you forever. Disputes and judgments, but people are people, right? Arguments happened. A farmer claimed his neighbor stole water from his irrigation ditch. A merchant accused a customer of cheating on weights. Even families squabbled. Because nothing brings out conflict like dividing a sack of rice. When this happened, villagers usually went to a local headman first. If he couldn't settle it, it escalated to the magistrate or the samurai in charge. Trials weren't drawn-out affairs with lawyers and juries. It was more like, hear the complaint, hear the defense, look at who's standing straighter and bowing deeper. Decide. And when the samurai made a decision, that was it. No appeals, no, I'll see you in court. If you argued too much, congratulations, you just made it worse for yourself. Punishments, no slaps on the wrist. Here's where things got harsh. Punishments in Edo Japan weren't about rehabilitation. They were about scaring the rice out of you so you never tried it again. For minor stuff like stealing a chicken, you might get public humiliation, a beating, or your head shaved, which was like erasing your dignity. For bigger crimes, punishments escalated fast. Hands cut off for theft, exile for rebellion, and yes, execution for serious offenses. Samurai had the right of kirisut gomen, literally authorization to cut and leave. If a commoner disrespected them in a serious way, they could cut the offender down on the spot. Imagine spilling water on someone's sandals, and suddenly you're one wrong bow away from disaster. Scary, definitely. But also, the fact that people knew this made villages surprisingly peaceful. Few dared test the boundaries. Rare but real violence. Don't get me wrong, samurai weren't walking around slicing random villagers every day. In reality, Edo Japan was one of the most peaceful times in the country's history. Wars were rare, large-scale battles non-existent, but tension was always simmering. Bandits lurked in forests, rival clans might stir up trouble, and peasant uprisings, though not common, did happen when taxes became unbearable. The possibility of violence was enough to keep everyone cautious. Think of it like living in a house where your smoke alarm never goes off, but you know if a fire starts, it'll scream loud enough to wake the dead. A theft in the village. I remember one particular incident that made the whole village buzz for weeks. One evening, a farmer discovered that part of his rice store had gone missing. Not just a handful, but sacks. Big deal, considering rice was life itself. Whispers spread faster than wildfire. Who did it? Could it be an outsider? Maybe a neighbor? The village headman called a gathering. Accusations flew. People shifted nervously, and you could feel the fear crawling over everyone's skin. Stealing rice wasn't just stealing food, it was stealing survival. Finally, suspicion fell on a young man whose family had been struggling after a poor harvest. The samurai were called. They listened silently, their hands on their sword hilts, and the tension thickened like miso soup. The verdict, guilty. The punishment, public shaming and lashes. The young man was dragged out, tied and beaten while everyone watched. His family wept, villagers looked away, and I stood frozen. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about making an example. The message was clear. If you steal, you pay with pain and shame. Did it work? For years afterward, nobody dared to touch rice that wasn't theirs. Fear was an effective teacher. Living with fear and respect. That's the weird paradox of the village. People respected the system, but they also feared it. Respect came from seeing samurai as protectors, men who kept bandits away, ensured order, and upheld honor. Fear came from knowing that same sword, protecting you, could also strike you down if you slipped. It created a society that was disciplined to the core. People didn't litter the roads, they didn't skip taxes, and they didn't start random brawls, not because they were saints, but because they knew the consequences. My feelings in all this, as for me, living under such constant authority was unsettling. In modern life, we complain about cops giving us tickets or the government raising taxes. Here, though, authority felt like a sword hovering inches from your neck, ready to fall if you sneezed wrong. I found myself bowing lower than anyone else, speaking less, and keeping my eyes glued to the ground whenever a samurai walked by. Humor helped me survive the fear, like I'd whisper to myself, "Don't trip, don't sneeze, don't breathe too loud. You'll be fine." But inside, I was constantly on edge. I wasn't used to living in a place where one wrong step could mean ruin. And yet, strangely, people seemed okay with it. They'd lived like this for generations. For them, order and punishment weren't crushing. They were just the price of stability. Wrapping up conflict in the samurai village wasn't about epic sword duels or war cries echoing across mountains. It was quieter, subtler, but no less serious. It was arguments over water, punishments for theft, tension when taxes pressed too hard. Justice here wasn't about fairness. It was about survival, about keeping everyone in line so the system didn't collapse. And while I respected the order, I couldn't shake the weight of it. Living every day under such strictness was exhausting. Even beauty, the rice fields, the festivals, the laughter of children, was shadowed by that constant reminder. The sword kept peace, but it also kept fear. Still, not everything in the village was grim discipline. There was another side to life, rituals, tea, poetry, and spirituality that gave meaning to all the hardship. That's where I'll take you next, into the world of honor, ceremonies, and the unseen ties between the living and the spirit. By now, I'd seen the sweat of the farmers, the discipline of the samurai, and the sharp edge of justice. But life in the village wasn't only about work and punishment. There was also beauty, moments where life slowed down, where people touched something deeper. Rituals, ceremonies, poetry, faith. These things stitched the community together. And in the middle of it all stood one word that defined the samurai more than swords ever could: honor. The ceremony of tea. The first time I got invited to a tea ceremony, I thought, cool, free tea, maybe with snacks. Spoiler, not the vibe. The tea ceremony wasn't about chugging a hot drink. It was about mindfulness, harmony, and respect. Every movement, pouring water, whisking the tea, placing the cup, was deliberate, like choreography. Samurai and wealthy villagers treated it almost like a spiritual ritual. I sat there on the tatami mat, legs going numb, trying not to sneeze while everyone else looked calm and serene. The tea, bitter. Like, why am I drinking ground up leaves mixed with regret? Bitter. But the atmosphere, strangely powerful. It wasn't about taste. It was about presence. For a moment, the noise of the world faded, and even I felt part of something bigger. Poetry and art samurai weren't just warriors with stern faces. Many of them wrote poetry, painted landscapes, or practiced calligraphy. Haiku, those tiny 3-line poems, were everywhere. Farmers recited them at festivals, monks scribbled them on scrolls, and even tough-looking samurai shared verses about frogs, rain, or moonlight. Short, simple, but packed with meaning. I once overheard a samurai compose a haiku about watching rice plants sway in the wind. My brain thought, that's just plants moving, dude. But then I realized, when your life is bound to honor and death, noticing small moments of beauty is what keeps you human. The temple life. The village temple was more than a building. It was the community's anchor. Every morning, bells rang across the fields, a slow, deep sound that made even roosters pause. Monks guided villagers through Buddhist and Shinto rituals. They blessed fields before planting, prayed for rain, and performed ceremonies for the dead. Ancestor worship was huge here. Families believed their ancestors' spirits watched over them, so they lit incense, offered rice, and bowed low before small shrines in their homes. Walking into the temple was like stepping into another world. The air was heavy with incense, candles flickered against wooden beams, and chants rolled like waves. It made the chaos of daily life feel small. Festivals and seasonal rituals. Life was hard, but festivals gave people a reason to smile. New Year's was the biggest. Villagers cleaned homes, hung pine branches for good luck, and shared rice cakes. Children ran around with new toys, while adults drank sake and prayed for a better harvest. The harvest festival was another highlight. Lanterns lined the paths, drums echoed, and dances filled the night. Even samurai sometimes joined, though they stood at the edge, watching with a mix of dignity and amusement. For one night, the lines between classes blurred just a little. The weight of honor. But behind the laughter and rituals, one thing never left the samurai's world: honor. It wasn't just a nice word, it was life or death. Lose your honor, and you lost everything. A samurai who failed his lord, acted cowardly, or brought shame could only redeem himself through one ultimate act: seppuku, ritual suicide. I'll never forget the day I witnessed it. The seppuku ceremony. A samurai in the village had been accused of failing his duties. I won't go into the details. It wasn't about what he did, but about how he had to atone. The entire village gathered in silence. He sat calmly, dressed in white, a short sword laid before him. His closest friend, his second, stood behind with a long blade, ready to give mercy. The samurai bowed, recited a final poem about honor and loyalty, then carried out the act with terrifying resolve. The second ended his suffering swiftly, as was tradition. I had seen punishments before, but this was different. It wasn't fear, it was dignity, wrapped in blood and silence. The villagers bowed their heads, children clutched their mothers, and I, standing frozen, realized just how far the idea of honor could push a human being. It was both horrifying and strangely beautiful, a clash of life and death, loyalty and loss, living in the balance. That's what the samurai world was, really, a balance between brutality and beauty. One moment you're sipping bitter tea in silence, appreciating a leaf falling from a tree. The next, you're watching someone take their own life because of loyalty. For the peasants, these rituals brought meaning. Lighting incense, dancing at festivals, or whispering prayers to ancestors reminded them that even in hardship, there was something greater than taxes and mud. For samurai, honor was their religion, their guiding star, the weight they carried every second of every day. My reflections. I struggled to make sense of it. Back where I came from, honor meant holding the door open or paying back $5 on time. Here, honor could cost you your life. And yet, I couldn't deny the power of it. There was something magnetic about a society where values mattered more than survival. It scared me, but it also humbled me. When I left that seppuku ceremony, my knees were weak, my stomach twisted, but my heart, it was heavy with a kind of respect I'd never felt before. Wrapping up. So this was the soul of the samurai village, honor woven into every ritual, faith binding people to the unseen world, and beauty found in the simplest acts, pouring tea, writing a poem, lighting a lantern. It wasn't always kind, it wasn't always gentle, but it gave life shape, meaning, and dignity. And yet, as I looked at all this, the tea ceremonies, the poems, the ancient rituals, I also started noticing whispers of change, rumors of ships on the horizon, talk of strange foreigners with guns and machines. The world outside was shifting, and even the most sacred traditions couldn't hold it back forever. Which brings us to the final chapter, the end of an era. When I first stepped into the samurai village, it felt timeless. Rice fields swayed in the wind. Samurai walked with that straight-backed confidence. Kids ran barefoot, and the temple bell kept its rhythm. Days blurred into the cycle of planting, harvesting, festivals, and rituals. It was like stepping into a world that believed it could last forever. But forever doesn't exist. Even samurai couldn't stop change. Whispers of the outside world. It started as rumors. A traveling merchant passing through the market mentioned strange ships appearing along Japan's coasts. Big black ships with smoke rising from them, like floating monsters. They carried foreigners with pale skin, odd clothes, and weapons that could spit fire without arrows. The villagers whispered in fear. The samurai frowned but stayed silent. The daimyo sent scouts to learn more. For a society that had been closed off from the world for centuries, these whispers were like cracks forming in a wall that had always seemed unbreakable. I didn't know it at the time, but those ships were real. Westerners were knocking at Japan's door, and sooner or later, someone was going to open it. Signs of change in the village. At first, daily life went on as usual. Farmers bent their backs in the fields, women wove cloth, and kids shouted in the dust. But under the surface, things felt unsettled. The samurai still trained, but their swords suddenly looked less invincible. A katana could cut down a man, yes, but what about a gun that fired from across a field? Even the most disciplined warrior couldn't slice through a bullet. Some samurai grumbled, others doubled down on tradition, but everyone knew it. The world outside was changing faster than a tea whisk in a master's hand. My own unease, I began to notice it too. The strict order of the village, the endless rituals, the fear of punishment, all of it suddenly felt fragile, like a paper lantern in the wind. One night, I sat with a farmer's family around their small fire. They whispered about higher taxes, about the daimyo demanding more rice to fund defenses. A boy asked, "Father, what if the foreigners come here?" The father didn't answer. He just stared at the flames. That silence spoke louder than words. A farewell to the old ways. As months passed, the changes became harder to ignore. A traveling monk brought stories of cities stirring with unrest. Some samurai were abandoning their posts to seek new lives in towns. Merchants, once considered the lowest class, were quietly gaining power because of trade. The hierarchy that had held firm for generations was wobbling. And honor. Well, honor didn't vanish, but it started to look less like the steel of a sword and more like the ink of a contract. The age of the warrior was giving way to something else entirely. I remember walking past the training yard one evening. A samurai I had often watched, disciplined, precise, was standing alone. His katana lay sheathed at his side. He looked out toward the horizon, where the sky burned orange with the setting sun. He wasn't practicing anymore. He was just waiting. For what, I couldn't tell. But his stillness carried a weight heavier than any battle. The last festival, the final festival I joined in the village, was both joyful and haunting. Lanterns glowed, drums thundered, children laughed. On the surface, nothing had changed. But I noticed the elders' eyes. They carried a kind of sorrow, as if they knew this might be the last time the village celebrated as it always had. That night, a samurai recited a poem. The river flows on, carrying away our shadows. Mountains stay silent. No one said it outright, but everyone understood. The river of time was carrying the samurai world away. My departure. Eventually, it was my time to leave. I had lived, worked, and watched in this village, but I didn't belong to it. I packed what little I had, bowed deeply to the family that had sheltered me, and walked the dirt path out. Behind me, I heard the temple bell ring, slow, deep, steady. Ahead of me, the world was wide and unknown. As I walked, I thought about everything I had seen. The bitter taste of tea ceremonies, the laughter of children at festivals, the sweat of farmers, the steel of katanas, the silence of seppuku. It was a life both harsh and beautiful, simple and impossibly complex. And though I was leaving, a part of me would always carry that village, the discipline of the samurai, the resilience of the peasants, the whispers of honor in every act. Reflection, what it meant to live among samurai. Living there taught me things I never expected. I learned that strength isn't just about muscle or steel, it's about values. I learned that rituals, even small ones, keep people connected when life is hard. I learned that honor can both uplift and destroy. The samurai village was far from perfect. It was strict, unforgiving, sometimes cruel, but it was also deeply human. Every person, from the proud samurai to the barefoot child, was bound together by tradition, duty, and hope. Now, centuries later, the samurai are gone. The swords are in museums, the villages replaced by cities, the rituals practiced more for culture than survival. And yet, the spirit of that world lingers. In Japan's art, discipline, and sense of honor, you can still hear the echo of the samurai. Closing thoughts. When people ask me what it was like, I never give them a simple answer, because it wasn't simple, it was beautiful and brutal, peaceful and terrifying. Living in a samurai village was like holding a sword blade, sharp, dangerous, but shining with a kind of beauty you can't forget. And though that era has ended, Though the samurai have stepped off the stage of history, their presence remains, like a shadow at sunset or the sound of a temple bell drifting across the rice fields. That was my life in a samurai village. And honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything.